One. Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, the criminal justice system we have in our world today has existed and stood the test of time since the dawn of human existence because it had unwavering principles that sought out justice. Principles such as proportionality to the severity of your transgression, meaning you do something bad, you get a bad punishment, you do something chill, you get a chiller punishment. Retribution for the victim and the aggrieved, meaning people don't necessarily consent to perversions and the idea that just because someone subjects them to a science experiment, then they can somehow get a levy under punishment. And ultimately, rehabilitation for the victim. Because we have to understand, we're not talking about people who are life imprisoned because they're outside this debate. This presupposes, and I agree with the previous speaker, people who did bad shit, who are serious enough to be behind bars, but also have a capacity and incentive to be able to go out of that. We think this sounds good, and the previous speaker was quite glib and assertive in terms of how this works, but this is ultimately shady AF, right? Like, this is literally some Batman-esque Arkham Asylum, Hugo Strange kind of experimentation, which ultimately creates a predatorial and perverse incentive structure. A perverse incentive structure organized and sanctioned by the state, colluding with state and private correctional facilities to literally prey on the desperation and vulnerability of prisoners. These prisoners, who are in a very dangerous kind of situation because of their capacities and what they've chosen, and them also being in a headspace of them being behind bars. That is to say, for obvious reasons, all of these prisoners want to do everything they can to be able to leave. That is why in many instances they even try to escape. And in many instances, they even are willing to take their own lives, ladies and gentlemen, because of how sketchy and shitty it is behind the bars of a correctional facility. That is to say, side proposition preys on this and ultimately to some extent pushes them over the edge to potentially make this very sketchy and dangerous decision to be able to subject themselves to these hazardous kinds of experiments. We think this can fundamentally change the particular people, rewire their brain chemistry, have physiological effects like disability and degradation that can ultimately make them a shell, ladies and gentlemen, of who they were. Their side is literally justifying and condoning modern day lobotomy. Their side might say a few things, right, in preemption. Oh bro, don't worry, it's chill. We have clinical trials. Guys, they said that about the vaccine. And take a look at how many people are now experiencing higher likelihoods of congenitive heart disease and comorbidities as a consequence of that. I personally have high blood pressure, but if taking the fucking vaccine now means I'm more predisposed in the future over a curve of time to have a heart attack, I think I probably wouldn't necessarily take that and take the risk of necessarily getting COVID and coughing and maybe having some sort of worse kind of asthma. But on their side, because they prey on this desperation, you ultimately create this cognitive dissonance that's likely to push them over the edge in these dangerous experiments. A few pushes from our side, responses will be integrated. Firstly, even if they frame out and say that, oh, these people can consent to it, they're adults, they know what they're doing, that is a huge case of hyperbolic discounting. We think that these people, because of what I characterized in my peroration of wanting to get out, are likely to be able to look at the risk-reward in terms of a disproportionate way. This in and of itself is an affront to human agency and the ability of them to be able to determine their own ends. And even if there's a minority chance, like 10, 20% of becoming a vegetable, getting sick, becoming predisposed to like cancer, or having some sort of cognitive decline, because I subjected themselves to this, is ultimately harmful. Secondly, and this is a direct response to the previous speaker, oh bro, it's regulated. Even if you can regulate it with clinical trials, we think that the state, because they have an incentive with their science department and Department of Health to want to be able to push these things out faster, are literally using these guys as guinea pigs. Because my question is, why aren't normal clinical trials with people enough? Why are you subjecting and having some sort of double punishment to these urban poor and these particular people who probably were in a desolate and desperate condition to do that? The fact that it's hazardous, even in its mildest forms, is ultimately sketchy and can ultimately rewire their chemistry and lead to certain physiological harms which we think are too risky. I'll take the POI, whoever raised it. Go. 3, 2, 1. Moving on.
Yeah, so
Go.
you've already framed about the worst of mental health of prisoners and their helplessness. So don't you think that our side is catering to the solvency of these principles of these criminals in the first place?
No, because in status quo, we have things like a plea bargain wherein you can be someone who admits to their crime and can even be a witness and stuff to be able to reduce that. Or if you don't like that, you can have good behavior and parole. And that is my burden pushed aside proposition. Why are those things not enough? Why do you need to subject them to all these sketchy ass experiments? 3 impacts you get on our side of the house. The heart of our case is that you undermine the criminal justice system. This happens in the following ways. Number 1, you undermine the proportionality of it, meaning it has to be parallel or proportional to the severity of your transgression. That is to say, at any point, because I raped someone or because I murdered someone, and that's something the previous speaker does agree with, then I need to be able to serve the time. If you do the crime, you should serve the time. Any relief of that, which is not related to parole or a plea bargain, in itself undermines the severity of that. Number 2, retribution for the victim. Like I mentioned in my pre-oration, these people don't consent to someone killing their father or raping their spouse just because they subjected themselves in this mad science lab that literally is a disgrace and undermines those particular people who died and were harmed. Thirdly, and quite importantly, because we care about the prisoner too, and this debate presupposes they're going to be able to walk out into society. This undermines the principle of rehabilitation at the point in which they take on certain risk, at the point in which they can become a shell of themselves, and even if it's a minor thing like my thumb stops moving properly or I start having some semi kinds of convulsions, this is not something we're willing to take. Say no to this. We are very proud to stand on side negative.